There are allegations that war crimes were committed by the Sri Lankan military and the rebel liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam during the Sri Lankan Civil War, particularly during the final months of the Eelam War IV phase in 2009. The alleged war crimes include attacks on civilians and civilian buildings by both sides, executions of combatants and prisoners by both sides, enforced disappearances by the Sri Lankan military and paramilitary groups backed by them, acute shortages of food, medicine, and clean water for civilians trapped in the war zone, and child recruitment by the Tamil Tigers. A panel of experts appointed by United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon to advise him on the issue of accountability with regard to any alleged violations of international human rights and humanitarian law during the final stages of the civil war found credible allegations which, if proven, indicated that war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed by the Sri Lankan military and the Tamil Tigers. The panel has called on the UNSG to conduct an independent international inquiry into the alleged violations of international law. The Sri Lankan government has denied that its forces committed any war crimes and has strongly opposed any international investigation. In March 2014, the United Nations Human Rights Council authorized an international investigation into the alleged war crimes. War crimes are prohibited by the Geneva Conventions, of which Sri Lanka is a signatory. In 2002, the International Criminal Court was created by the Rome Statute to prosecute individuals for serious crimes, such as war crimes. Sri Lanka is not a signatory of the Rome Statute. Therefore, it is only possible for the ICC to investigate and prosecute war crimes in Sri Lanka if the UN Security Council was to refer Sri Lanka to the ICC, which is unlikely. However, individual countries may investigate and prosecute alleged culprits over whom they have jurisdiction, such as those with dual nationality. In addition, a number of countries apply universal jurisdiction in respect of certain crimes, such as war crimes, allowing them to prosecute individuals irrespective of where the crime was committed, the nationality of the culprits and the nationality of the victims. Background: the Tamil Tigers had been waging a full-scale war for an independent state of Tamil Eelam in the north and east of Sri Lanka since 1983. After the failure of the Norwegian-mediated peace process in 2006, the Sri Lankan military launched offensives aimed at recapturing territory controlled by the Tamil Tigers. By July 2007, the military had recaptured all of the east. The military offensive in the north escalated in October 2008 as the Sri Lankan military attacked the Vani heartland of the Tamil Tigers. After successive defeats, the Tamil Tigers were forced to retreat to the northeast coast in Mullaitivu district. The civilian population of the Vani also fled. The Sri Lankan government and human rights organizations have alleged that the civilians were forced to disobey the Tamil Tigers. By January 2009, the Tamil Tigers and the civilians were trapped in a small piece of land on the northeast coast. As the Sri Lankan military advanced further into Tamil Tiger-controlled areas, international concern grew for the fate of the 350,000 civilians trapped. On the 21st of January 2009, the Sri Lankan military declared a 32 square kilometers safe zone 5 kilometers northwest of Pathakudarapu, between the A35 highway and Chalai Lagoon. According to the Sri Lankan, the purpose of the safe zone was to allow the trapped civilians to cross into territory controlled by the military. However, very few civilians actually crossed into the military territory. The Sri Lankan military, UN and human rights organizations accused the Tamil Tigers of preventing the civilians from leaving. The fighting between the military and the Tamil Tigers continued, causing the civilians to flee from the safe zone to narrow strip of land between Nanthi Cattle Lagoon and the Indian Ocean. On 12 February 2009, the military declared a new 10 square kilometers safe zone in this area, northwest of Mullaitivu town. Over the next 3 months of brutal siege of the safe zone occurred as the military allegedly blitzed by land and air the last remnants of Tamil Tigers trapped in the safe zone. Satellite images of the safe zone published by the UN, foreign governments and scientific organizations showed heavy damage that could have only been caused by bombardment. Inevitably, many thousands of civilians were killed or injured. The UN, based on credible witness evidence from aid agencies as well civilians evacuated from the safe zone by sea, estimated that 6,500 civilians were killed and another 14,000 injured between mid-January, when the safe zone was first declared, and mid-April. There are no official casualty figures after this period, but a report in the Times claims that civilian deaths increased to an average of 1,000 per day after mid-April 2009. The UN has refused to confirm the Times' allegations. Estimates of the death toll for the final 4 months of the Civil War range from 15,000 to 20,000. A U.S. State Department report has suggested that the actual casualty figures were probably much higher than the UN's estimates and that significant numbers of casualties were not recorded. As the Civil War edged towards a bitter end in late April-early May, the number of civilians leaving the safe zone turned from a trickle to a torrent. On 19 May, the Sri Lankan government declared victory. After the end of the war, a number of countries and human rights organizations called for an independent investigation into the final stages of the Civil War. Accusations. International organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have accused both sides in Sri Lanka's long-running conflict of deliberately putting civilians at risk to pursue military objectives. Nearly 70,000 people were displaced due to aerial bombardment and artillery attacks by government forces in Mullaitivu and Kilinochchi, the organization said, and in the LTTE-controlled Vani area. The Tigers have hindered thousands of families from moving to safer places by imposing a strict pass system and, in some instances, forcing some family members to stay behind to ensure the return of the rest of the family. These measures seem designed in part to use civilians as a buffer against government forces with serious violation of international humanitarian law. Both sides to this long conflict have again shown that they will jeopardize the lives of thousands of ordinary people in the pursuit of military objectives, said Amnesty International spokesperson Yolanda Foster. In the absence of independent international monitors, Sri Lankan civilians lack protection and remain at the mercy of two forces with long records of abuse. The Sri Lankan government has furiously rejected all claims that its forces committed war crimes. In a June 2010 speech, President Rajapaksa insisted that his soldiers did not kill a single civilian. Our troops carried a gun in one hand and a copy of the Human Rights Charter in the other, the president said. These statements are at odds with multiple independent sources. The United Nations itself has said that at least 7,000 ethnic Tamil civilians died in the first 4 months of last year, just before the government claimed final victory over the Tigers, and high-level United States officials have said the U.S. has strong, credible allegations of evidence of atrocities during the prosecution of the war against the Tamil Tigers. United Nations, UN Commission of Human Rights 43rd Session. In March 1987, a draft resolution expressing concern at reports submitted by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, the report of the Special Rapporteur on Summary Executions and the report of the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances in Sri Lanka was submitted by Argentina to the now-defunct United Nations Commission on Human Rights. The resolution admonished Sri Lanka being caught in a spiral of violence and its use of torture against the civilian population. Sri Lanka reacted with shock and anger to the conflict being brought to the agenda. The resolution, calling upon all parties and groups to renounce the use of force and acts of violence and to pursue a negotiated political solution, based on principles of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, received wide support from Latin American, African, Western European countries and India. The resolution needed a 12-vote majority to pass. Two detailed reports on arrest, detention and torture in Sri Lanka, and the other on extrajudicial and arbitrary killings were distributed among delegates. Norway, Canada, Belgium and Australia joined Argentina in moving to support the original resolution in private, while 13 non-governmental organizations in a joint statement to the Commission stated, "The situation is so grave that it warrants exceptional and urgent consideration by this distinguished Commission. We appeal to the conscience of the distinguished delegates and the governments they represent to ensure that all essential steps are undertaken in terms of international human rights and humanitarian law." They deplored the use of foreign mercenaries by Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka sought Britain, France and the United States' support. These countries expressed concern at the rapporteur and working groups' reports. British mercenaries of the secret KMS unit working in support of the Sri Lankan government had left the island that year because of atrocities committed against the Tamil population, walking out after complaining that the Sri Lankan Special Task Force was running out of control and was indiscriminately killing and torturing Tamil civilians. Sri Lanka sought Pakistan's aid in submitting a counter-resolution extolling the efforts of the Sri Lankan government and condemning Tamil groups. This counter-resolution was not considered by the Commission. Given Sri Lanka and Argentina's then membership in the non-aligned movement and gradual build-up of support for the resolution, the Sri Lankan government eventually agreed to negotiate a consensus resolution with the other Commission members as a compromise, with mediation conducted by Senegal. The sessions proved incredibly heated in their exchanges, and at one stage co-sponsors Argentina, Canada and Norway threatened to abandon any negotiations and pass the original resolution. A Belgian delegate stated, "We now know how Sri Lanka has been conducting negotiations with the Tamils on the ethnic problem." Eventually, the UNHRC passed Commission Resolution 1987-61 unanimously, a revised resolution of ECN 4/1987 L74 Rev. 1 on 12 March 1987 that called upon the government to intensify its cooperation with the ICRC in the field of dissemination and promotion of international humanitarian law, but amended with criticism on torture and disappearances removed. Martin Ennals of International Alert stated in his intervening statement, "There can be no doubt that the security forces of the government of Sri Lanka have committed serious offences against civilians caught up in the internal conflict. That innocent civilians have been killed, not in the crossfire between factions but in the course of the day-to-day existence of family life." UN Human Rights Council. At the 11th Special Session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in May 2009, 17 countries attempted to get the UNHRC to investigate war crimes in Sri Lanka. They put forward a resolution that deplored abuses by both the Sri Lankan government forces and the Tamil Tigers, urged the government to cooperate fully with humanitarian organizations and to provide protection to civilians and displaced persons, and made an appeal to the Sri Lankan government to respect media freedom and investigate attacks against journalists and human rights defenders. This was thwarted after the Sri Lankan government received support from China, Russia, India and developing countries. The UNHRC instead passed Resolution S-11/1 on the 27th of May 2009, which commended the Sri Lankan government's actions, condemned the Tamil Tigers and ignored allegations of violations of human rights and humanitarian law by government forces. This resolution was passed by 29 votes to 12 votes with 6 abstentions. The UN expert panel report published in April 2011 has, based on its findings, recommended that the Human Rights Council reconsider a resolution at HRC S11L1 Rev. 2. At the 19th regular session in March 2012, the UNHRC adopted Resolution 19/2 on promoting reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka by a vote of 24 in favor, 15 against and 8 abstentions. The resolution welcomed the constructive recommendations contained in the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, a commission of inquiry appointed by the Sri Lankan government to look back at the civil war, and noted with concern that the report did not adequately address serious allegations of violations of international law. It called upon the government of Sri Lanka to implement constructive recommendations made in the LLRC report and to take all necessary additional steps to fulfill its relevant legal obligations to initiate credible and independent actions to ensure justice, equity, accountability and reconciliation for all Sri Lankans. It requested the government to present an action plan detailing the steps that it has taken and will take to implement the recommendations made in the Commission's report, and also to address alleged violations of international law. The resolution also encouraged them to provide advice and technical assistance on implementing the above-mentioned steps, and requested the OHCHR to present a report on the provision of such assistance to the Human Rights Council at its 22nd session in March 2013. Two last-minute changes to the resolution, pressed by India, made it unobtrusive in nature and non-judgmental in approach. These amendments gave the government of Sri Lanka a veto over any future recommendations by the OHCHR. There was no reference to alleged war crimes or an international investigation, as called for by human rights groups. The failure of the Sri Lankan government to comply with Resolution 19/2 led to Resolution 22/1 being passed in March 2013 at the 22nd regular session of the UNHRC. This resolution called on the Sri Lankan government to carry out an independent and credible investigation into alleged violations. However, the resolution failed to establish the independent international investigation that human rights groups had called for. The Sri Lankan government ignored the resolution, and as a consequence in March 2014 the 25th session of the UNHRC passed Resolution 25/1 authorizing an international investigation into alleged war crimes during the 2002-09 period. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. On 25 October 2009, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called for an independent international investigation of possible war crimes committed during the last few months of the war in Sri Lanka. UN Secretary-General's Advisory Panel. In June 2010, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon appointed a 3-member panel of experts to advise him on whether war crimes were committed in the final stages of the civil war. The panel consisted of Marzuki Darasman, Stephen Ratner and Yasmin Sukha. The panel looked into accountability with regard to any alleged violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, and whether the commitment on human rights accountability given by Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa to Ban Ki-moon has been implemented. The panel examined the modalities, applicable international standards and comparative experience with regard to accountability processes, taking into account the nature and scope of any alleged violations in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan government reacted angrily to the panel's appointment, calling it an unwarranted and unnecessary interference with a sovereign nation. It stated that the panel would not be allowed to enter Sri Lanka, a move criticized by Darasman. The panel's appointment was welcomed by the United States and EU but criticized by Russia and China. The panel met for the first time on the 19th of July 2010. On the 12th of April 2011, the panel handed over its report as the report of the Secretary-General's panel of experts on accountability in Sri Lanka to the Secretary-General, who passed on a copy to the Sri Lankan government. The Sri Lankan government immediately rejected the report as fundamentally flawed and patently biased. The report was not initially made public to allow the Sri Lankan government time to make a formal reply. On the 16th of April 2011, the report was published in The Island, an independently owned nationalist Sri Lankan newspaper. It had been suggested that the Sri Lankan government leaked the report so that it can issue a full rebuttal before the report is officially made public by the UN. The Sri Lankan government did not make a formal reply, and on the 25th of April 2011, the UN published the full report. The evidence obtained by the panel revealed a very different version of the final stages of the war than that maintained to this day by the government of Sri Lanka. The panel found credible allegations, which, if proven, indicate that a wide range of serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law were committed both by the government of Sri Lanka and the LTTE, some of which would amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The panel concluded that the conduct of the war represented a grave assault on the entire regime of international law designed to protect individual dignity during both war and peace. The panel found credible allegations that the Sri Lankan military government killed civilians through widespread shelling, shelled hospitals and humanitarian objects, denied humanitarian assistance, violated the human rights of civilians and Tamil Tiger combatants, and it violated the human rights of those outside the conflict zone, such as the media. The panel found credible allegations that the Tamil Tigers used civilians as a human buffer, killed civilians attempting to escape Tamil Tiger control, used military equipment in the proximity of civilians, forcibly recruited children, used forced labor, and killed civilians using suicide attacks. Specific findings of the panel: the Sri Lankan military used large-scale and widespread shelling, causing large numbers of civilian deaths. This constituted persecution of the population of the Vani. The Tamil Tigers kept hostage 330,000 civilians who were fleeing the shelling and trapped in an ever-decreasing area. The Sri Lankan government tried to intimidate and silence the media and other critics of the war using a variety of threats and actions, including the use of white vans to abduct and to make people disappear. The Sri Lankan military shelled on a large scale the 3 safe zones where it had encouraged the civilian population to concentrate. It did this even after saying it would cease using heavy weapons. The Sri Lankan military shelled the UN hub, food distribution lines and Red Cross ships coming to rescue the wounded and the relatives camps. It did this despite having intelligence as well as notifications by the UN, Red Cross and others. Most of the civilian casualties were caused by Sri Lankan military shelling. The Sri Lankan military systematically shelled hospitals on the front lines. All hospitals in the Valley were hit by mortars and artillery, sometimes repeatedly, despite the Sri Lankan military knowing the locations. The Sri Lankan government systematically deprived civilians in the conflict zone of humanitarian aid, in the form of food and medical supplies. Adding to the suffering, the government deliberately underestimated the number of civilians in order to deprive them of humanitarian aid. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed between January and May 2009. Many died anonymously in the final days. The Sri Lankan government subjected the civilians who managed to escape the conflict zone to further deprivation and suffering. Screening for Tamil Tigers took place without any transparency or external scrutiny. Some of those separated by the screening were summarily executed whilst women were raped. Others simply disappeared. All IDPs were detained in closed overcrowded camps where they were deprived of the basic rights. The conditions in the camps resulted in many unnecessary deaths. There were interrogations and torture in the camps. Suspected Tamil Tigers were taken to other facilities where they faced further abuse. The Tamil Tigers refused to allow civilians to leave the conflict zone and kept them as hostages. The civilians were sometimes used as human shields. The Tamil Tigers forcibly recruited members during the whole of the Civil War, but this intensified during the final stages of the war. Some of the recruits were young as 14. The Tamil Tigers forced civilians to dig trenches, risking making them look like combatants. The Tamil Tigers kept on fighting even when it became clear they had lost in order to save the lives of its leaders. This futile prolonging of the conflict resulted in many civilians dying unnecessarily. The Tamil Tigers shot at point blank any civilian trying to leave the conflict zone. The Tamil Tigers fired artillery from near civilians. They also stored military equipment near civilians and civilian structures such as hospitals. The Tamil Tigers carried out suicide attacks against civilians outside the conflict zone even during the final stages of the Civil War. The report states that the credible allegations demand a serious investigation and the prosecution of those responsible. If the allegations are proved, senior commanders, military and political, on both sides are liable for prosecution under international criminal law. The panel noted the Sri Lankan government's attempt at accountability consisted solely of investigating the actions of the previous government and the Tamil Tigers, and not of the present government's actions during the final stages of the war. The panel concluded this is not in accordance with international standards and fell dramatically short of international expectations. The panel found the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission established by the Sri Lankan government to be deeply flawed and not up to international standards of independence and impartiality due to deep-seated conflicts of interests of some of its members. The mandate of the LLRC, its work and methodology meant that it was incapable of investigating the serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law or of examining the causes of the Civil War. The panel concluded that the LLRC could not satisfy the commitment on accountability given by President Rajapaksa and Ban Ki-moon. The panel found that the Sri Lankan justice system was incapable of providing accountability. The independence of the Attorney General had been eroded and the continuation of emergency regulations and the Prevention of Terrorism Act precluded the judiciary from holding the government accountable on human rights issues. Military courts and other domestic institutions were also incapable of providing accountability. The panel found that the government's triumphalism and the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora's inability to acknowledge the Tamil Tigers' role in the humanitarian disaster also hindered accountability. The panel criticized the UN for not protecting civilians. Its reluctance to release casualty figures undermined the call to protect civilians. The panel a number of recommendations, including that there be an independent international inquiry into the alleged violations of international law, and that the Sri Lankan government carry out genuine investigations of the alleged violations of international humanitarian and human rights law committed by both sides.